You are listening to Medicine and the Machine with Medscape Editor-in-Chief Eric Topol and Master Storyteller and Clinician Abraham Verghese as they talk with experts around the globe about the hottest topics in healthcare. This podcast is intended for U.S. healthcare professionals only.
Hello, this is Eric Topol for Medscape Medicine and the Machine with my co-host Abraham Verghese. And we have a special thrill today because we have Professor Tricia Greenhalgh from the UK to visit with us. And I've been following Tricia and her work for many years, but this is the first time I get to meet her, at least through Zoom. So it's really particularly exciting. So let's say welcome, Tricia.
Well, it's great to be here. And thanks for inviting me to be on the show.
Yeah, well, it's not a problem when you have somebody with your background to want to talk with you. Let's just review for those who don't know Tricia. She's one of the leading primary care academicians in the world. Her background in terms of her education was University of Cambridge, University of Oxford. She had posts at University College London, Queen Mary University, and now she is running a program on healthcare delivery where it intersects with social science. She oversees degrees, advanced degrees in translational health. And it's just stunning how much contributions you've made during the pandemic. In fact, some of the most extraordinary papers, whether it be on airborne transmission, or long COVID, and on, it's just amazing. So we're so glad to have you today and kind of get your views about not just the pandemic, but also about, the whole, primary care, how to read a paper, one of your most famous papers, all that kind of stuff. So maybe we can start off with just kind of a general sense. We're 3 years into this mess, and we haven't done all that well in managing this virus. So what are your kind of initial thoughts?
Yeah, well, that is the $64,000 question, as they say, isn't it? I was pretty impressed with the Lancet Commission report, which came out in September of this year, 2022, where they identified a number of failures. And actually, it made quite depressing reading. They described the pandemic response as a global failure. And there were a number of things that I think it's worth picking up on, but one of them, one of my favorite topics to talk about, is the failure to recognize that the virus was airborne. And actually, I would say it's more than that. It wasn't just a failure to recognize that it was airborne, it was prematurely assuming that it was not airborne. So people didn't just keep an open mind and say, well, it might be airborne. In general, they assumed it was not airborne. They assumed it was droplet transmitted. And we started off down this path of ritualistic hand washing. Now, hand washing is not a bad idea. I'm a parent. I taught my kids to wash their hands. Of course, it's a good idea to wash your hands. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is closing our minds to the possibility that this virus could travel in the air. And that, I think, got us into a lot of hot water.
You had a lovely paper sort of describing why it was that science couldn't get its voice heard properly, and the sort of the political and the social forces that sort of subsumed all this. In fact, I'm just in awe of the way you've been able to dissect out these various components. I mean, it was the first time I'd read a paper that helped make sense of all these dynamics, hopefully serving us well in the next epidemic. And can you talk a little bit about that? Why voices like yours and ours were not necessarily heard early on?
Well, we did publish a paper in Wellcome Open Research. I published it with Mustafa Ozbiljan and Damian Contandriopoulos. An international group, I suppose. Now, Mustafa is a critical social scientist, and Damien's also a social scientist. And we wanted to apply theories of scientific thinking. So some sociologists, for example, study scientists. They study how scientists get together, how they work, They do anthropology. They come and watch scientists in their labs. People study systematic reviewers as if they're a kind of strange tribe. It was the social science of science where our work was specifically located. And I can actually give you a background to that because, funnily enough, I was attending a WHO committee meeting. I was doing it obviously by Zoom, which is what everyone was doing in the pandemic. And I have a feeling it was in about September or October 2020. And I wasn't a member of that committee. I was there representing a charity, actually. So the charity asked me if I could step in for them because they were doing something else. And so there I was. And I was observing the machinations of this committee. And I was absolutely struck at how they refused to contemplate the possibility of airborne spread. They refused to look at the evidence. And actually, I remember putting links in the chat and getting replies from members of this committee saying, oh, we don't look at that evidence. It's low quality. And I thought, oh, gosh, well, I'm only here as a guest, so I can't report on that. I can't write a paper about that, but I can certainly write a paper taking things that were in the public domain and really unpacking what it was about this particular WHO committee that made them so sure that the droplet theory of transmission was correct, and so sure that the evidence base in favor of that was strong, and so sure that aerosol science, the whole of aerosol science, was both poor quality and irrelevant. And so Damien and Mustafa and myself applied Bourdieu's theory of scientific capital, which is a wonderful theory. Bourdieu was the person who talked about capital in general. When you're bringing up your kids, you teach them things, and you don't just teach them mathematics and spelling and things. You also teach them how to behave, and you perhaps take them to concerts and teach them, how to be nice kids type thing. And so Bourdieu's theory of capital was that certain members of the educated classes will teach their kids all sorts of things that will build their capital. And he also had this idea that scientists build capital in particular disciplinary traditions. And guess what? Infection prevention and control scientists build their capital partly by doing randomized controlled trials of hand washing, for example. I mean, that's a very specific example, but scientific capital within infection prevention and control does not include the kinds of things that aerosol scientists do, which is, for example, measure how gases travel in spaces. That's just not part of scientific capital. But the other aspect of scientific capital is accolades and prizes and medals and publications in journals that are held to be prestigious. And so you started off this podcast by sort of reading out a few bits from my bio. And the idea is that you present me as someone who's got scientific capital in whatever topic it is we're talking about. Now, one of the things about that Infection Prevention and Control Committee at WHO was that the scientific capital of particularly leading members of that committee had already been built. They had prizes for this, that, and the other. They published the definitive studies of hand washing, all that kind of thing. So we unpacked all that, and we unpacked it both for the WHO and also for public health people. I think we used UK. Where else do we use? Canada, probably, and I think we used Japan. So we compared, and actually one of the interesting things about the Japanese response was that they kept an open mind. The Prime Minister himself and other senior members of government published on a website on the 9th of March 2020, we don't know how this is transmitted, but we have a bit of a hunch that it might be airborne. So while we're continuing to investigate that, perhaps you would not meet with too many people in indoor spaces, and perhaps you'd like to wear masks. So they shared that scientific uncertainty. But the other thing they did was they got advice from senior aerosol scientists who had quite prestigious appointments in Japan. It was quite a cool thing to be an aerosol scientist in Japan. Well, I can tell you, it wasn't a cool thing to be an aerosol scientist in the UK or in Canada or in the USA. And indeed, the WHO now famously ignored a letter from 238 aerosol scientists who wrote to them in July 2020 saying, look, we think this is really important. We think lots of people are dying unnecessarily. We'd like to help. And that letter was just ignored, not quite ignored, because the committee did change its website, but they changed the website in the opposite direction. They changed the website to say, we still think there's no evidence of airborne spread, which was in retrospect was very, very sad. Anyway, the point about it was that I was applying my training as a social scientist, because I studied social sciences in the middle of studying medicine. Actually, I took some time out and did a bit of social science. So we was applying that, and actually we very recently applied that same set of ideas in a paper that is less social sciencey, in a paper, a sort of mainstream paper for the British Medical Journal, which was published just a couple of months ago as part of the BMJ's series of papers to hopefully inform the thinking of the official inquiry. Whether or not the official inquiry reads those papers is up to them, but the BMJ hopes they will.
Well, Tricia, there's a lot of things that you just mentioned. Firstly, just to also reinforce Japan best performance in the pandemic in the world as far as industrialized nations. So I'm sure it had something to do with the openness and the proper communication. Also, you know, they, as you well know, they were distributing masks to their residents very early on. And what I don't understand, and you know, the paper you published on the 10 reasons for airborne transmission in the Lancet, I think is one of the most cited papers, certainly altmetric, one of the highest of the whole pandemic, which says a lot because you know how many papers published.
Yeah.
But how can physicians deny the use of masks with a respiratory virus? I mean, how can scientists and physicians say that masks don't help when you have a virus that is respiratory? I still don't get this.
It's sort of counter to common sense, isn't it? Well, I qualified as a doctor in 1983, and by the early 1990s, I think it was 93, so I've been qualified about 10 years. And I remember because my last kid was born in 92, so I'd just gone back to work basically, and I arrived back and there was this new thing that hadn't been around when I went on maternity leave. This was evidence-based medicine. And at the time I was working in University College London, and I, like almost everybody then, you know how you're sort of young, just got your first academic job and you think, oh, look, this is the new thing. So you jump on it. And within a couple of years, I was actually running these training courses in evidence-based medicine in London. And Dave Sackett from the EBM community was running them in Oxford at the time. And we were, you know, liaising. So I was very much part of that exciting early evidence-based medicine movement. Now, I'm not anti-EBM. It's really important to say I'm still absolutely passionately sold on the idea that randomized controlled trials are a great idea for some questions. I'm a cancer survivor. I owe my life to a randomized controlled trial, okay? The treatment that cured me 7 years ago of rather nasty cancer was tested in an RCT, so I'm not opposed. But over the last, 30 years or so, I have begun to realize that whilst randomized controlled trials are a brilliant idea for testing drugs, they are a catastrophically bad idea for testing certain other things, masks being one of them. And the reason for that is that and there's a lot of philosophical reasons, but there's also common sense reasons that, that the RCT is a very artificial thing. You randomize people to either have A or B, and you have to keep everything controlled. Well, the thing about masking in a community, in the real world, is you cannot control everything. And in fact, you can control very little. If I ask you to give your consent to wear a mask and then come and get tested as to whether you've caught COVID, that's great because you give informed consent. But what about everybody else in the community? You can't recruit everybody you just can't do it. It's just completely impossible. So the only possible thing you can answer in a randomized controlled trial of masking is, does person A wearing a mask prevent person A developing COVID? You can't find out whether person A wearing a mask prevents person B getting COVID because you never consented person B to be part of your trial. It's really that simple. The other reason why these trials of masking are a purely thought experiment is that, guess what? We're in a dynamic system. If we reduce the transmission of COVID by 10%, and that carries on over, I don't know, I'm not very mathematical, but if we say that the doubling time is 9 days, and if we reduce it by 10% every 9 days, it all adds up exponentially. And after a few weeks, you've prevented 40,000 cases. But how can we capture that in the randomized controlled trial design? We simply can't. What we can do is model it, or we can observe what happens in the real world. We can observe, oh, look, in these schools, there were mask mandates and they were enforced, and look how many kids got COVID, et cetera, et cetera. You can do those things. So it's not bad science to look at real world case studies. Mm-hmm. It's not bad science to say, oh, on the 8th of March in Amsterdam, there was a very famous performance of, I think it was the St. John Passion, and 130 people got COVID and 4 of them died. The conductor nearly died. Oh, they were singing. Maybe there was something. Maybe someone who was singing was also transmitting a virus. It's not bad science to speculate that that may have happened, just because it wasn't a controlled experiment. It was a real world experiment, and we should be looking at those. So I think, the question of how come doctors ignored all the evidence around airborne spread, we can trace that back to evidence-based medicine. Without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It was hardwired into us to say we need a randomized controlled trial for everything. And we didn't get a randomized controlled trial for masks. We didn't get a randomized controlled trial for airborne spread. And so people say, oh, there's no evidence. There's no evidence. Yeah. It's not quite that simple. I'm caricaturing it slightly, but I think that's broadly speaking what happened. And I think, I'm from the same department as the Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine, and I can confirm that there wasn't a lot of looking at the full range of evidence in favour of aerosol transmission. There just wasn't, because I was working with that group initially, and they didn't want to look at it. They didn't want to look at it. And of course, that's what we did. And in fact, very early on, it's actually one of my students came to me and said, we've got this question that's come in from the public, blah, blah, blah. And I said, look, that looks to me like a question about how fluids travel in spaces. And I can't answer that. You're going to have to find somebody. And so I Googled it all, and I found Lydia Boroweaver, who was studying. She was a world expert on sneezes, on how sneezes travel. And she would film people and their sneezes. And I thought, gosh, she's published in the New England Journal about sneezing and coughing. And I dropped her an email and I said, would you like to work with us? And I suppose that was my initial introduction. And the rest of the aerosol scientists, who are just great people, yeah, we all met on social media.
I must say that I trained in the same era as you did and watched EBM evolve into this sort of an arrogance around it, an arrogance around that viewpoint. And it also came with a dismissal of anything that wasn't quantitative. I mean, qualitative studies of the kind that I do.
Yeah.
And I was excited to see one of your papers sort of talking about that imbalance of how qualitative science and narrative is dismissed. Talk about
Yeah, and yet, you know, we always think of qualitative science as sort of interviewing a few patients or something like that. And I think that can be done well or badly, just like mathematical modeling can be done well or badly, RCTs can be done well or badly. But there's also aspects of basic science are effectively qualitative. I mean, my doctorate was in insulin kinetics, and you know, I had to kind of look at what happened to a protein. I mean, it was all very qualitative. You were looking, you don't know what I did, but there were quantitative aspects, but there was also a lot of thinking, a lot of, you know, talking about mechanisms and theory. And I guess if I'm ever going to use this this interview to plug a paper of mine, I would say, and obviously it's written by not just me, but with co-authors as well. It's this paper we published recently in BMJ Evidence-Based Medicine called Adapt or Die. And we put down the gauntlet to evidence-based medicine. You have to adapt or die. You're going to die. And the reason why I thought the editor would probably change that title, but he didn't actually. So what we were talking about was saying, yeah, look, RCT is fantastic, but we need to know the mechanism by which something works. And we went back to Sir Austin Bradford Hill, who led UK's first ever randomized controlled trial of streptomycin for tuberculosis, I think it was, and the Bradford Hill criteria for causation. So on the one hand, Bradford Hill was this kind of blue-eyed boy of the EBM movement because he'd done the first RCT. And on the other hand, he'd actually said we need to know the mechanism by which it works. So he said you can have this probabilistic evidence from your randomized trials, but you also need to know how the phenomenon happens. So we were drawing on some work by, I think it was Mike Kelly, Jeff Aronson. They're sort of people from the EBM movement. I know both of them. I think Jeff taught me when I was a student, so he ain't a young man now, because I was at medical school 40 years ago. But they coined this expression, EBM plus. I think it was them. It may not be them, but they certainly used it before I did. EBM plus means all your EBM stuff plus mechanistic evidence, plus evidence of causality. And one of the things about the evidence of causality is that you have to stack it up. There's evidence, there's this kind of evidence and that kind of evidence. You know, say, for example, the evidence of transmission of SARS-CoV-2. There was those concerts, the super spreader events, the kind of events where lots of people tended to get infected, funerals, you know, basically places where people were indoors singing or chanting. But that alone wasn't enough evidence. There was also evidence of isolating the virus. The first time they isolated the virus, I think, was from the air inside someone's car, because it's a tiny space, and presumably people are breathing away. And there was loads and loads of other kinds of evidence where they connected the ferret cages and you know, the air from one cage went into another cage, and then all the ferrets in the second cage got COVID, all that kind of thing. So you're stacking up lots of different kinds of evidence, and taken together, that evidence builds a case that that COVID is transmitted through the air. The other thing is that there was no disconfirming evidence. Nothing disproved it. People had set up all sorts of studies to disprove this hypothesis, and none of those had demonstrated, had produced disconfirming evidence. I mean, there were certainly failed studies. There were studies where people looked for virus in the air and didn't find it, but aerosol scientists would come along and say, but you haven't done that right. that's just not the way you would find virus in the air, even if there was virus there. And so that kind of critique, the peer review, was very important. But certainly the adapt or die paper presented the EBM community with this kind of ultimatum: is you're going to have to accept mechanistic evidence, because if you don't, you ain't going to be no help in the next pandemic. Waiting for your RCTs. And that's had a mixed response, I have to say. Even the editor was nervous. The editor is a nice man. He tweeted about our paper. He said, here we go, adapt or die. And then he got slammed by all these EBM diehards on Twitter. So he deleted his tweet. And I think he regretted publishing it. And certainly one of the reviewers, who I didn't think really understood the paper. We spent a long time responding to the reviewer two, and then reviewer two was invited to publish a rebuttal in BMJ evidence-based medicine. So if you want to read the counter argument to what we presented, it's also been published. But personally, I don't think he actually takes apart our argument. He just restates that EBM is what it is. And I think in a way, if that's the best that EBM can do to argue against the need for mechanistic evidence, then we rest our case.
Yeah, well, I think you've made that one very solid. And I wanted to just change a little bit to the other big topic that we could get in today, which is related, because if you get an infection, you can get long COVID. And that reason I bring that up is, one of the things that you're really proponent standout is the humanistic qualities of medicine. As you mentioned, and as we know, your program is integrating social science with the traditional interdisciplinary aspects of biomedicine. Now, there's just like the dissing of masks, there's people out there who still don't believe there's such a thing as long COVID. It's incredible. Yeah. Just incredible. And I wanted to get your views about this, because I don't understand. There's been now so many reports, so many millions of people around the world are suffering significant disability.
Yep.
And there still continue to be all these people saying they're making it up. They're just depressed or whatever. Can you address that?
Yeah, there's two ways into this, aren't there? One is that there is, as you know, Eric, there is no single biomarker that I as a doctor can measure and say you do or you do not have long COVID. Now, but it isn't unique. Long COVID isn't unique as a condition in that, but if you go into hospital with chest pain, and you say, I've got chest pain, they'll do you your high sensitivity troponin, and they'll tell you whether you're having a heart attack or not. So we are quite used to the idea of being able to do a test that will discriminate reasonably well with people who've got the condition from people who haven't got the condition. We can't do that with long COVID. The diagnosis is made on the basis of the history, the pattern, and how things unfold. That, for example, it often fluctuates, not always, but those kind of things. And those, I guess, are fairly soft indicators. So that, I think, is why some doctors in particular are quite skeptical. Second reason is that doctors probably don't read all the obscure literature where all kinds of metabolic abnormalities have actually been quite well documented. But those metabolic abnormalities don't tend to get measured in patients who are attending long COVID clinics, or even more with primary care physicians. People don't tend to get many tests. But there's another thing that I think is we need to factor in, and that is the risk, the political risk, the ideological risk, if we accept that long COVID is a real disease, if we accept that it is common, if we accept that in some cases it is very persistent, it may be, in fact, it could be lifelong. We do not know. It's only been around for 3 years. We don't know whether people who are not better yet will ever get better. Now, if we accept that that is the case, that basically means that either society is going to get sicker and sicker and sicker, and more people of working age are going to be unable to work, or we're going to have to implement major changes in our way of life to prevent COVID. And that means expensive investments by governments and businesses and public buildings in ventilation systems and filtration systems. And it also means that if you get on a bus or a train or a plane, you're going to have to wear a mask. And someone might have to make you wear a mask. Now, we've been round and round this argument as to whether that is a reasonable and acceptable thing. And in some settings, the libertarians have won. It's really not accepted. I think particularly in schools, you know, if you've got sort of 13-year-old kid or something like that, I mean, why should my little kid have to wear a mask? This is interfering with their learning and with being a normal child and all the rest of it. But if that kid catches COVID, brings it back and gives it to the dad or the granddad, and they develop long COVID, we have to contemplate that this is going to be a major impact on society, which isn't going to go away. It's not like, you know, the 1919 pandemic flu that just sort of was with us for a season and then died out. COVID may not die out. And so I think people are not ready to get their heads around that. And so in the absence of a biomarker, and given that most of the evidence is buried in journals that most people don't read, I can see why this is happening. I really can. And where people change their minds is when a family member develops long COVID, and then they realize that, well, maybe it's not all in the mind. But yes, it's an interesting and really a tragic phenomenon. But if you go back to 2003, you know, and then follow up people who had SARS, they had long SARS, you know, SARS-1. Yes. They had exactly the same kind of thing. It didn't manifest exactly in an identical clinical way, but it was very comparable.
What it's also very comparable to is chronic fatigue or you know, myalgic encephalopathy, in the sense that it's hard to define. You have a lot of disbelievers and people who are skeptical, and then you have patients who become rabid, you know, fanatics and angry if you dismiss any of their symptoms. It's become very charged, the whole field of long COVID, I think.
It is very charged. And I think I'm not an expert on CFS-ME. I think there are certainly parallels, but I think there are also some differences. And, you know, people with a specialist interest in CFS-ME would know more than I do. But certainly one of the things that is similar is what the patients call gaslighting, the idea that doctors say to them, there's nothing going on here. You know, you could just sort yourself out, man up or whatever. And that's deeply insulting for a patient. I mean, we've got patients on we're doing a study called Locomotion. We've got patients on our advisory group who've got long COVID. And we have long conversations with them about the kind of mind-body link, because what we're not saying is that there's no mental component. You know, I once had fatigue after a viral illness. I mean, it only lasted a month, but it was long enough. But I remember feeling pretty miserable and depressed about it, and all that kind of thing. So was that depression, or not really depressed, but I was miserable? Was that due directly to the virus, or was it a mental reaction to the fact that I couldn't do the normal things that I wanted to do? And I still don't know the answer to that. But actually, once my chronic fatigue got better, my mental health improved quite quickly as well. And I think the idea that we would split it into bodily symptoms and mental symptoms, it doesn't work like that, because you're one person, and we treat the whole person.
You know, no question about that. Before we wrap up, I wanted to get your views on one other matter that brings us together, which is communication. Just from our discussion today, I would have guessed a lot of this, but just from our discussion, I now can diagnose that you're one of the most clear-eyed, persuasive physician researchers I've ever met. Okay. But also, you're very active on Twitter. Twitter is in the midst of what appears to be a self-destruction act by Elon Musk. It has served as a very, I think, important way to exchange information and, whatnot, to not just the medical community, but to the public as well. So
Yeah.
what are we going to do now? What has been your experience with that platform, and what's your plan?
Yeah, great question. Twitter is the town square. I think not just my COVID work, but my work on a lot of different scientific topics has been greatly informed and enriched by a dialogue that is directly with the public, with the lay public. I tweet about my scientific work, other scientists follow me, medical journals follow me, politicians follow me, but citizens and patients follow me, and everybody chips in. And actually you have to be quite brave and quite humble to share your ideas with the lay public, because guess what? They're just, just like kids, that's not true. But the idea that when you've got a kid who's asking, hey, why does the sun rise? And you think, oh, I thought I knew that. And you try to explain it. And so people who are asking the naive questions can often make you realize that you don't understand your science as well as you thought you did. And it helps. I've always found it really just useful and helpful. And people say, why do you waste your time on Twitter? I say, Twitter saves me time. It saves me time. Anyway, what's happening? Well, Twitter isn't dead yet.
Right.
I put out a tweet this morning, and it was all about an argument I was having with a reviewer, because the reviewer said, you don't need any theory. Why are you going on about theory? Well, where's your evidence that theory helps? And I put out a tweet and I said, can people help me? And there's this wonderful response thread now with about 50 suggestions linking to articles that have demonstrated the usefulness of theory. And so that's a nice thread, and I've already sent it to my students. So Twitter isn't dead yet, but it is true that for all sorts of reasons, it looks like the moderation of Twitter is being compromised. There's going to be far fewer people going in there and checking whether things are correct, whether they're reasonable. I've certainly had some shocking, slightly pornographic images cross my timeline in the last few days, which I haven't seen for quite a long time. So I wonder if that's also going to get worse. I'm staying at the moment. Someone said, stick around and fight like a Ukrainian. And I rather like that.
That's good. I like that. I hadn't heard that.
It's really good, isn't it?
Yeah.
I have also joined Mastodon, but I'm not really very active there at the moment, because the thing about Mastodon is I can link with fellow scientists, but I can't get that immediate dialogue with the public. Right. I also have about 2,000 followers on Mastodon and about 175,000 followers on Twitter. So at the moment, it's still a kind of, I get more response on Twitter. Sure. And also it's easier to use. There's been a lot of work on that platform that's made it very, very easy to use, easy to tailor, easy to curate. You can get your threads, all that kind of thing. But actually, what I think will probably happen is that it will go into a dip. It may get sold. Somebody might get a bit bored with this new toy, and then it'll revive again. I actually think it's going to pick up. Maybe that's because I'm an optimist.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say what a pleasure it's been to hear you. And I think one of the dangers of medicine is that we get more and more specialized. We put blinders on, and your career and your publications are just a wonderful reminder that it's art and science, and we've got to train our trainees to keep that in mind and be open to all the sciences out there other than medical sciences to inform our practice. So thank you for.
Yeah, I mean,
I'd
it's a
agree with
shame-
that.
It's a shame, Tricia. You're just too logical. You just
Am I
you just-
logical?
you're too reasonable. I mean, my goodness.
Well, there's a lot of
delight.
common sense, actually, Eric.
Yeah.
It's worth picking that up because one of the things that I'm getting into is the philosophy of pragmatism. And pragmatism really is about common sense. It's the philosophy of common sense and being confident to keep in touch with your common sense self. So yeah, I would sign up to that without a doubt.
No, you're a model for that and for so much. We've learned a lot from you and about you through the pandemic. And obviously your career spans far greater than that. Your impact across medicine has been profound. So thank you for joining us. It's been a real treat. I know the Medscape audience will thoroughly enjoy this. And I hope we'll be able to reconvene with you and happier times when the pandemic is largely behind us and we get into other things like your contributions, how to read a paper and all these other things that you're doing over the years. But thank you, Tricia. Really, this has been so much fun. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks for having me.